Hey everyone, so it's been a few weeks since I last posted a video, and that's because I've basically been tied up with work projects the past few weeks and have been working weekends and doing all sorts of things, so I just haven't got around to it. So I decided I've got some time today at last. I finished up with a few things and I just thought I would like to record a little wrap up of the books that I read in January. Just a little note on the video quality. I'm now using my old little Canon camera because my iPhone, it really has no memory left at all and I can't record much more than about 60 seconds of footage. So we'll see how we got on with this in the meantime until I get an upgrade for my phone. Anyway, in 2017 I actually read 51 books, all recorded in this, which is a book journal I got a few years ago. I basically just jot down the books that I read throughout the year just to keep track of what they are, and also because it's quite nice to know how many books you read in the year, because you do forget, and usually it's a nice surprise actually how many books you have read. So I was quite chuffed that I read 51 last year because it's the most I think I've read in the past few years. You know what it's like, things get in the way and sometimes you want to read and just don't have the time. So I'm hoping I can read about the same this year, maybe even more, we'll see. In January anyway, I read 8 books and I'm just going to go through them here with you. So the first book I don't actually have at the moment because I lent it to a friend who's also coincidentally the friend who introduced me to this author, and the author is William Boyd. The book is The Dreams of Bethany Melmoth and it's a collection of short stories. Now normally I did enjoy them, but I think with William Boyd I prefer his novels, and in particular I like his novels where he takes a character and he sort of tracks their whole life from the beginning until the end, and he's generally in those, he kind of weaves in real life events, real life people. So the short stories were good, but there's a book review actually on the Guardian website if you want to look that up, and it's quite spot on I think in what they say, that some of the stories are quite frustrating the way they end, because they kind of just I mean, I know that's the idea of short stories, they don't wrap everything up, they're not a novel, you don't have to, you can't expect them to wrap everything up, but the last 2 stories, which are also the longest stories in the collection, they do end quite abruptly, and in the last story in particular you really have no idea why what happened or really what's going to happen next, and that kind of frustrates me a little bit because I do like to have some sort of wrap up even in short stories. I mean, it's hard to explain, but yeah, I did enjoy them, but I would say that definitely I prefer his novels, and I'm glad I read it, but it wouldn't be his favourite book of mine. Some of the characters also appear in the later stories, so although they're very loosely linked together, but not really. And I think my favourites in the collection, although they irritated me the most because of the way they ended, my favourite stories were The Dreams of Bethany Melmoth and then the final story, which I can't remember what it was called, but I think I preferred them because they were both the longest stories in the collection and you sort of got to know the characters a bit better, you got to spend more time with them. I think I have to be in the mood to read short stories, and I kind of went into this thinking that actually it was a novel, or at least one of those novels where all the stories mixed together in such a way that it could be read as a collection of short stories or as a novel, but it is a collection of short stories. So maybe if I read it again I would like it better, but I did enjoy it. I would recommend that you read it if you like William Boyd, but if you haven't read him before I would probably recommend go and read one of his novels like Any Human Heart or A New Confessions. Anyway, that was the first book I read in January. I'm going through my list here so that I remember everything that I read. So the second book was Hollow City by Ransom Riggs, and it's the second book in his trilogy, Miss Peregrine's Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. I read the first book and his collection of short stories in December. Flew through them. Again, I don't want to give spoilers, so I'm not going to explain too much about what this is about, but if you've seen the film or read the book, you'll know that it's about a group of peculiar children who have got sort of strange bodily deformities and abilities, and this young guy Jacob, after his grandfather's death, he travels to an island in Wales where he discovers Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. He finds out a little bit about his grandfather, about himself, and a whole load of a whole lot of things happen. Basically the first book ends that Miss Peregrine, the headmistress, who can also, spoiler alert, shapeshift into a bird, is captured, and the first book ends where basically they're trying to get her back. It's different from the film, obviously, the first book, the way it ends, but the second book here picks up, obviously, where they're leaving the island to go and find Miss Peregrine and to kind of work out what's going on and why people are being kidnapped. So that's not a really good description because I don't want to give spoilers, but yeah, it's a really, really good book. And again, I flew through this really, really quickly. The writing is really vivid. It's just really original as well. I mean, if you haven't read the books, it's full of these old photographs, and Ransom Riggs, actually, I think there's little interviews and things with him at the back, but I think in the first book he possibly picked photographs to work with the story that he was writing, but sometimes he actually shapes the story around the photographs that he found. So the photographs are all used to illustrate what's going on in the book, and it works really well. I mean, it works really well, but because they're old black and white photographs of real people, they're also quite freaky. It sort of adds to the whole sort of spookiness of the stories. But yeah, I really, really enjoyed this trilogy, and as I say, I read each book in about a day. You can just fly through them because the writing's really good, the story's original, and it's just really enjoyable. So yes, pick that up if you like fantasy adventure stories. So the next book that I read was a little short one that I found in my local co-op, which has a great second-hand book table. So for the princely sum of 50p, I discovered this little gem, which I think has been reprinted. So it's The Peculiar Life of a Lonely Postman by Dennis Proulx, I think that's how you pronounce it. And it's been republished by Hesperus Press in London. It was originally published a few years ago in Quebec, I think. But anyway, the title appealed to me, the cover of the book appealed to me, that's why I picked it up. And then I read it and I thought, this sounds interesting. It's a short little book, so you can read it very quickly. It's basically about a postman who, he opens people's letters. He steams open people's letters and reads them. Sometimes, I think, keeps photocopies them sometimes, but obviously puts them back into the letters and delivers them. But yeah, he opens people's mail, and one day he opens a letter. These two people are writing to each other, but they're writing in haiku, which, if you're into poetry, you know the haiku is the Japanese poetry form, which is, now let me see if I remember the system, is it 3, 5 and 6 syllables? I should know this, I should know my poetry. But anyway, they're very short little poems, and those are examples of some of the poems. So he discovers this couple are writing haiku poetry to each other. He falls in love with the woman through the letters that she's writing, through the poems that she's writing. And again, I don't like to give spoilers, but something happens where he becomes a little more involved than he should be in this couple's lives. And yeah, it's just, I hesitate to say it's a sweet story because, I mean, you do like the main character, even though it sounds really creepy that he's steaming open people's letters and, you know, reading personal things. You do like him. I liked the main character, and it's unexpected the way the story finishes. Again, I don't like to give spoilers, but it's not quite what I thought it was going to be, and that was nice. It was a nice surprise. It was quite strange, but also it was, it rounded off nicely. So again, not the best review. I mean, I think I will do some book reviews where I actually go into a bit more detail and give spoilers and everything, because it's easier to talk about. But this was just, you know, a nice little read with the poetry interspersed throughout it. That was quite nice as well. And yeah, it was just, I think it's an author that I would like to look up some more of his work, and I think actually some of it is being republished this year by the London publisher, so I'm going to keep a lookout for this guy. Okay, so I'm going to go through this a bit quicker because I'm rambling a bit. And the next book that I read was the final book in the trilogy of the Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children, and it was Library of Souls. Now, again, it's the final book in the trilogy, so I don't want to give spoilers, but again, it was a book, I just flew through it. The story is just really original, and especially because I've read a lot of young adult fiction last year, and it kind of got a bit samey what was going on in those books, and so it's really refreshing to read this trilogy and for it to be very different and to be as original as it was. So yeah, this picks up the story from book 2, obviously, and the main character Jacob kind of learns a bit more about what he can do, what his peculiarity is, and yeah, I can't give spoilers, so you just have to read this trilogy. It's just really, really good. So the next book was something a little bit different, and it was Chris Packham's memoir, Fingers in the Sparkle Jar. So if you probably know Chris Packham by now, because he's been in the media quite a lot this year, because he was diagnosed on the Asperger's. He was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, so it's kind of like on the autism spectrum. I remember reading an interview with him a little while ago, quite a while actually, I think, before he sort of he did his documentary and everything on it, where I'd read that he did have Asperger's. And then when I heard that he had his memoir was written about that, I kind of thought it'd be really interesting to read. I really enjoy him as with all the wildlife programs and things that he does. I've always thought he was very interesting. So because I'm not really a big memoir person, which I don't know why, I think I'm possibly getting more into them as I get older, which possibly is just something that you do as you get older. You get more interested in people's lives. But this was a good book. Now, it's quite, and he admits himself that it is put together quite oddly, which I think is nice because it kind of reflects. I've always thought him as quite a quirky sort of person. But when I first started reading it, I thought it was quite disjointed because it hops about from, there's different tenses, so it's like third person narrative, then from the first person point of view. It hops about a lot in terms of time periods, so it doesn't just start at the beginning of his life and take you through up until the present day. It hops about a lot, in the 60s, or not the 60s, in the 70s, and then interspersed within that there are little bits from the present, or from not quite the present, but from the the more recent past as an adult. So at the beginning it sort of annoyed me a little bit, but then I kind of get into it. And I kind of just thought, well, I accepted that's the way it's been written, but it is a little bit disjointed in that regard. Also, the way that it's written, it is very poetic, very descriptive, and I think it helped me to kind of read it how, like, sort of imagining Chris Packham reading it, because as I say, I watch him a lot in things like Spring Watch and those wildlife programs that he does, and I know the way he talks, and he's very passionate about subjects. He kind of just, he kind of just talks and almost doesn't stop for breath, and that's the way some of the writing is. So, and there's all this imagery thrown in, and all these, as I say, really poetic descriptions, which sometimes at the beginning it feels almost over the top, but again, you kind of get used to it, and you kind of get into the style of his writing. And knowing the sort of person that he is, having watched him on TV and knowing how he would describe things, it suits, if you know what he's like, then you'll understand the way this is written. So I think it does help to know how he kind of talks and everything anyway. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. I would have liked to have found out a little bit more about his, the rest of his life, because as I say, it's focused more on his childhood, and again, bits of his childhood. It doesn't take you all the way through his life. So, there's things to do with his work and stuff like that, which I would have been quite interested to hear more about. But it is just a snapshot of his life, and it is really good, and again, I would recommend it. So, how are my descriptions going? Or am I getting any better? I don't know. I think I ramble a lot. The next book I read was Annie Proulx, I think is how you pronounce her name, The Shipping News. Now again, this is a book that I picked up in the co-op secondhand book table, and obviously it's a very well-known book. It's a bit of a modern classic, so I thought, yeah, I'm going to read this because I have no idea what it's about, and it's just one of those books where you think, you know, it's probably in lots of people's TBRs. Now, I was quite happy to learn when I read the blurb in the back that it was about a hapless, hopeless hack journalist living and working in New York, who then moves to Newfoundland. So as a journalist myself, I like reading about other journalists and reading about other writers, and I like the great outdoors, so I thought this is going to be really great. Now, it feels almost sacrilegious whenever you sort of don't like a book that a lot of people do like, but I didn't love it. I wouldn't say that I disliked it. I enjoyed it, but put it this way, I was glad when it finished, and I was really itching to go on to reading something else. I don't know, it's just, I don't need a lot of things to happen in a story, so it's not really that not lots of things didn't happen, but I can't really put my finger on it. It just wasn't for me, and I wanted to finish it because I just don't like to not finish books unless I really hate a book, and unless it's really, really badly written. That's the only reason that I won't finish it. So obviously it's really well written and it was interesting, but it just wasn't for me. I just didn't love it enough, but I'm glad I read it. But I don't know that I personally would run out and recommend to people to read it. Now, I do have some friends on social media who, when I posted a picture of it and said I was reading it, a couple of them actually came back to me and said, oh, this was their favourite book and that they were going to reread it, and somebody else said that they really loved it as well. So yeah, but that's the whole point of books. Not everybody likes the same books. It would be a bit boring if we all liked the same books. I don't think it's a book I would ever reread. I don't reread very many books anyway, because I just would rather read new books. But yeah, I'm glad I've read it, but I wasn't a big fan of it. So we'll put that to the side. The next book I read was Matt Haig's How to Stop Time, which is his most recent book. I quite like time travelling books, even though I don't really like them when they're really confusing, but this one wasn't. It was very straightforward. Now, again, I liked the book, but I got a little bit annoyed with the ending. I felt the ending was quite rushed, and I didn't really understand why one of the characters did what he did at the end of the book. And the protagonist at the end of the book, I sort of also didn't really understand when he finally reaches this moment of clarity on a particular thing. I sort of wasn't quite sure how it took him so long to reach that conclusion, but all in all I did enjoy it. I mean, it's quite a light read. As I say, if you don't know what it's about, it is about a guy called Tom who basically ages really, really slowly. So he's about 400 years old, and there's a few people, not very many, but there's a few people like him in the world, and they sort of, there's a guy that kind of not controls them, but there's a guy that kind of tracks them down and sort of helps them out a little bit. So it kind of switches between his earlier life and his present day life, and you know, it is good, it's well written, but again, I wouldn't say I loved it. Again, I was sort of glad when it ended, but I'm glad I read it, and it was a really good idea. I think it was just the ending that kind of put me off a little bit, because I felt that it was a little bit abrupt, the way it all just suddenly wrapped up. Now, save the best to the last. The last book that I read in January and finished possibly, I think, just the first week of February, so it kind of just slipped in there, was this one, A Gentleman in Moscow by Proulx. Now, this was one that I got in Waterstones over Christmas, one of my book vouchers, and it was a book I'd never heard of before. I just was drawn to the title because I have this sort of, I don't know, I'm just sort of drawn to books about Russia. I don't really know my Russian history very well, but I just like books set in Russia. And when I read the back of it, I was really intrigued because it's about a count who is put under house arrest in the 1920s and basically has to live in the attic of a hotel in Moscow for the rest of his life. And I thought, well, that sounds really interesting, because what is going to happen in this book if you're stuck in a hotel in an attic? You know, what's just the conversations you might have, you know, how does want to occupy themselves in a hotel for their whole life. I was really interested to see how that was going to work out. So I absolutely loved this book. As soon as I started reading it, I knew basically from the first page that I was really going to like it, and I tried to actually drag it out as much as I could because I didn't want to fly through it. I really liked it so much. And again, I don't want to give spoilers, but it's about the Count, who I defy anybody to read this book and not to actually love the Count, because he's just a really, really lovely character. And yeah, it basically just starts off with him being put under house arrest in Moscow and what happens as he lives his life out in the hotel. And if you're like me and don't really know your Russian history, you will learn things from this book, which is great. I love reading books where, you know, they're obviously set in real, you know, the characters live their lives through events that happened in real life. There were some things that, as I was going along, actually I kind of had to Google, because I like to really understand a book whenever I'm reading it, and there were some things they're talking about, you know, about Lenin and Stalin and just the regimes and everything that were going on, that my knowledge is quite scatty, so I wanted to make sure that I just sort of read up a little bit around it as I was reading the book. So yeah, I really loved it from that point of view, because you got a sort of insight into Russia, into the history, as well as this really interesting story about the Count who's living his life in the hotel, and about the characters that he met when he lived there. In particular, there's a little girl called Nina that she makes friends with him, and it's yeah, I don't like to give spoilers, because I always think when you read a book, I personally don't like to know very much about them going into them, and I think that it's just something that I'd really recommend that you pick up, and you will really, really enjoy it. So those are the books that I read in January. I'm rereading a book at the moment in February, and I've read a couple of books already this month. Work has been quite hectic, so I haven't read as much as I would like to, but hopefully that will change pretty soon. Anyway, if you've been reading anything interesting, let me know in the comments below, and hopefully it'll not be too long for the next video. Hopefully this one isn't too long, but thank you for watching, and chat soon. Okay, bye.